People outside, if you want to come in and grab a seat near the front. Hello, Dr. Hendricks and friends outside, come on in. We'll get started. I'm Serene Jones. I'm the president here at Union, and it is my great honor to welcome you to this afternoon's panel discussion. We are very honored to have our panelists with us to discuss the theme that has been titled Shades of Black, Finding My Voice. This is the last of a series of 4 events that we have had this month, our Trailblazers Month, that have been in honor of the Reverend Dr. Jim Cohn, who not a day goes by in this place that he is not mourned and missed and celebrated for his remarkable life. If you have a chance after this discussion and haven't seen it, I encourage you to walk down the administrative hall in Auburn Hall and see the portrait of him that we dedicated earlier this year. So this evening, the panel is going to be talking about Dr. Cohn and his legacy. They're going to be focusing on the book, Said I Wasn't Going to Tell Nobody, which he finished 6 months before he passed. And this will be the first occasion we have here in this place to talk about a book which talks about his life in his own words. I want to thank especially the Alumni Council, who had been supportive of this evening. I want to thank the Trailblazers Committee, Brenda Ford, Reverend Brenda Ford, thank you for all of your work. All of the student caucuses that worked on the Trailblazers Committee, the Black Caucus, the Black Women's Caucus, the Fierce Caucus. Thank you all for your work on this. And thank you to Emily Odom and Kevin Bentley for all of your labor. So we can get to the point of why we're here this evening, I'm going to turn it over to Hasan Xavier Henderson Lott, presently an MDiv student at Union and a great leader who will be moderating this evening's conversation. Hasan?
You've been with us all week long, and we're so grateful that your presence is here now. We've been reflecting and conjuring up your presence, your essence, in both the name of Jesus Christ and the name of James Cohn. They've been bound and braided and tethered together here all month. And so we acknowledge that you are present, you're here with us, and we don't take it for granted. And so we pause to name you, to name not only who you are to the world, but who you are to Union, who you have been to us, what you have done and what you continue to do in our lives. As we speak about you, speak to us now. We're listening and we're grateful. Amen. My name is Hasan Xavier Henderson Lott. I'm a third-year MDiv here at Union, and I'm really honored to be here. I'm excited about this panel. I've been anticipating it all month long. We've had some great time together, this Trailblazers. We've had awesome services, and all month, this is the thing that I've been looking most forward to. And so I will now invite the panelists to each introduce themselves, and then we will go on with the conversation.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Charlene Sinclair. I am a graduate of Union, MDiv, MPhil, PhD. And I'm also very excited to have this conversation. I must say that this is the first time I have been back to Union since Dr. Cohn's passing. So there will be, I'm so clear, even as I'm sitting here, there will be not only moments of nostalgia, but moments of mourning and moments of connectivity. And so if at any time I choke up, know that choking up is from a place of just of deep love as well as lamentation, and I'm excited to be in this space having this conversation with all of you.
My name is Kendrick Kemp. I graduated here 2016. I'm back.
Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Henderson. I received my MDiv here. I'm currently a PhD student here. It's a pleasure to see you all come out tonight. Really appreciate it. I appreciate being on this panel with my fellow panelists. I just want to thank all who had a hand in making this event possible, in particular Kevin Bentley. I know that he worked very hard to make this a success, so just want to acknowledge him and everyone. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Wendy Marshall. I am the ancient one on the panel. I graduated with an MA from Union Seminary in 1992. And, yep, happy to be here.
I was shaking in my seat in 8030. We were in the James Baldwin, Life and Thought of James Baldwin class, and we had just had a major breakdown in the conversation. It was a polarized debate between white students and black students. We were discussing, I believe, The Devil Finds Work, one of James Baldwin's essays, and the politics, right, the racial politics in the media. And I was so unhappy with the way that Dr. Cohn engaged the classroom. And I made it very known to him. And so we had this breakdown, and it was unresolved because we had to rush to our break, 15 minutes. And he comes and he lays his hand on my shoulder. And he says, I know what you're feeling. I've been there myself. Come to my office and we can discuss it later. And so I came. And he instilled in me what it means to prioritize liberation, freedom, and health. Dr. Cohn emphasized that what I saw of him, in him, during that classroom setting was him refusing to engage a conversation in a way that would hinder or cause him to give up his commitment not only to liberation, but to his own health. And so he ensured that he ensured me that his priority is black freedom, that black emancipation by any means necessary, even when it comes to the classroom space. And I have held on to that. It is something that continues to inform my own scholarship, the way that I engage conversations. And so I'm very, very grateful to have had the opportunity to engage Dr. Cohn in that way. I'm wondering for the panelists, what are some moments, Dr. Cohn throughout the book mentions, right, he engages the classroom in a really non-traditional way when he finds himself as a student and when he finds himself in the position of teaching as a professor, that the classroom space is something that is not necessarily stoic, right, or traditional or classical, but it's something to be stirred up. It's something to be engaged directly. What were your own experiences of Dr. Cohn in the classroom, whether that is as a student or maybe as a TA, and what are some of those lessons that you have been able to glean from those experiences, those conversations with him? And we can do popcorn.
Okay, I leaned in, so I'm going to lean in. I think there are few students that go into Dr. Cohn's ST 103 class where they don't hear Dr. Cohn say, you know, you've engaged God with your heart in your churches and in your homes, but in this space, you will love God with your mind. And I do think that that was the core of the lesson that I learned from Dr. Cohn. You know, as I sit here and I see folks that started Union with me, I remember us looking around and, you know, it was really profound that he said that. You know, every time you leave the class, there's something more profound and you walk out and you're talking about it. But I didn't really understand what that meant for a long time after. Because I also had an experience with Dr. Cohn, because I'm a community organizer. I came to seminary, and Dr. Cohn told me that, no, you leave that out there. You know, when you're in here, you are here to learn. And I thought, if this isn't the biggest crock of crap, how could this man that talks about liberation actually tell me that I shouldn't be involved in liberation? And I was pissed. I was really pissed because, you know, I had blown him up so much in my mind, and I felt in that moment that he was a complete sellout. And then I leaned in and recognized that there can be no liberation if you don't have a critical consciousness. If you don't understand what is at play, if you don't do the work of analysis, then the work you are doing in the so-called fight for liberation is nothing more than leading sheep with sheep. And so Dr. Cohn's idea of how you love God with your mind was a call for us to have the kind of critical consciousness so that we can love our people into freedom, rather than continuing to perpetuate the very systems that were the cause of our oppression. And that was a long lesson learned, but it was probably one of the most critical lessons that he ever taught me.
I know I first met Dr. Cohn in the late 80s. I had 2 strokes, and I was trying to stay sane. I was in a dark place, and I was living upstate New York, and I went into a secondhand bookstore, and I saw Black theology and Black power, and so I got it. I ran back. Well, I went back home, got my friend. He read it. He was reading it to me, and man, it just hit me. I was missing the Blackness. I came from I'm a PK. You know, my grandfathers was pastors, my father's a pastor, my brother's pastors, you know, and they never talked about social justice or Blackness. But when I read his work, his first book, it just gave me some fire, you know, keep on going. And because if I didn't have that, I don't know where I'd be today. Because I was really gonna give up. That's how dark I was, you know. So he really he helped me that way, trying to find myself.
So, I think one of the things I'll most take away with me from my experience here at Union was having the opportunity of being Dr. Cohn's research assistant and course assistant for about 6 years. So my work with him ranged everything from helping work on the book to helping him with his courses. Of course, he taught the famed ST-103, but he also taught a variety of different seminars. Topics range from Reinhold Niebuhr to God, suffering, and the human being, Black theology, Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, James Baldwin. So being able to help him with those courses was just an amazing privilege that I'll always keep with me and cherish. as someone who's aspiring to be a professor, and as someone who has actually done a lot of teaching before even coming to Union, one thing that I really marveled at with Dr. Cohn was the seriousness with which he took the vocation of teaching. See, for him, being in the academy wasn't just about writing great books, wasn't just about giving also lectures and presenting at different conferences. He really valued the vocation of teaching and took it seriously. So what do I mean by this? His syllabi, if you ever get a chance to check one out, I highly recommend it. They were essentially little books. I mean, I can't tell you how often he'd be on the first day of class, he'd walk into class, we'd hand out the syllabi, and it would land on the table, and the students' eyes would just widen like, oh my gosh. These things were literal books. Of course, he'd have the weekly assignments, but he'd also have a big bibliography in the back. He'd have recommended readings. I mean, these were truly unbelievable documents. And despite having taught these various seminars multiple times over the years, every single semester it was different. I was able to see him work and craft each syllabi specific for that semester, even if he had already taught the subject before. So he was always constantly trying to improve his teaching and offer a unique and informed experience for his students in each respective class. I also was able to see him work. Every day he read. Didn't matter that he was the father of black theology. Every single day he went about the discipline of reading for many hours a day and writing and thinking. I recently heard this great quote by the basketball player Jason Kidd. He's one of the greatest players ever, was recently inducted into the Hall of Fame. And they said, Jason Kidd, what differentiates the great players from the very good players? And Jason Kidd said, the great players never get tired. They never get bored at what they're doing. And thus, they're always practicing. They're always working to improve. Dr. Cohn never got tired of study, of teaching, of perfecting his craft, of expanding his intellectual abilities. And that's what made him so great. And so just being around him and learning from him as teacher, learning from him as hard worker, as academic, is something that I'll really value. Lastly, I'll also say this. I mean, I have 1,000,001 stories that I could share about working for him. But make no mistake, he was old school, and he was a hard man. And he demanded a lot of his students, and for those of you who have been in his classes, you know what I'm talking about. And he also demanded a lot of us, those who have served as his assistants. And so, I'll give you an example. Before every class, every seminar, by the time he arrived to the classroom, he wanted the seats and the desk arranged a certain way. He wanted every student's name tag placed on those desks. He wanted them out. He even wanted his chair positioned in his special spot. Now, I learned very quickly, if I failed to do that, whoo, man, I'll tell you, there was a lot to pay. So I made it a habit of getting to class 30, 40 minutes early and just making sure that everything was as he liked it. But I bring all that up to say, and I'll close with this. Yes, he was hard. Yes, he was serious, but that's because he believed in the power and the importance of theology, of teaching, of intellectual work, of what goes on here in the academy, in Union, because he really believed that, kind of what Charlene was saying, he believed in the power of thought, of ideas to inform and to give fire to our movements and the work that we do outside of the classroom. And so that's something I always take with me, just the importance and the value and the seriousness with which he took the vocation of teaching and scholarly work.
Okay, so I would just add that Cohn believed in black people and the power of black people, our ability to be bearers of democracy in this place. So what I want to say about Cohn is that Cohn helped validate my revolutionary trajectory. my understanding of the dangers and how terrible white supremacy is, and how and heteropatriarchy and capitalism and all that. And so for me, and I just want to say Sally McNichol is sitting right there, and Sally McNichol was my TA in SD 103. Yay, Sally. For me, more than any other teacher, any other professor I ever had in post-college studies, Cohn made me know that it was okay for me to grow up and fight for my people as if my life depended on it.
Chapter 5 of Said I Wasn't Going to Tell Nobody is entitled When He Saved My Soul, Learning from My Students. And he opens it up this way. Dr. Cohn, you don't know a goddamn thing about the gay experience. A white male student shouted at me from the back of the room in my Foundations in Christian Theology class. I stopped speaking and looked straight at him. What flashed into my mind was a similar outburst I had made 20 years earlier in a class taught by my advisor, Dr. Watson. But unlike my advisor, I wasn't angry. I knew he was right, and that he was hurting from homophobia in the midst of the AIDS crisis in the 1980s, as I was from racism in the 1960s. Although I was trying to address homophobia in society, churches, and theology, he needed more. Silence filled the room, and I had to break it. You're right, I replied, my eyes still focused on him. I don't know much about the gay experience, but I know enough to talk about theologies emerging out of struggles of gays and lesbians for justice, initiated by the Stonewall Rebellion, June 1969. They found their voices at Union, especially Carter Hayward, Beverly Harrison, Gary Comstock. I'm just getting started in my study on those who speak from the underside of history and which, like the voices of Black theology, are not even heard in dominant Western theology. Oppressed people have a right to speak about ultimate reality out of their own experience. That's why I began writing about God and the Black experience. But since Blacks are not the only oppressed people, it is my responsibility to include many voices of the oppressed people who fight for dignity, even though I don't know as much about them as I know about Black people. Jesus' story, Cohn says, empowered him to write about what he means for Blacks struggling for dignity. Now, he says, I want you to do the same. I cannot speak for you, but I hope I can inspire you to find your voice as I found mine. That's why I teach. And I think that for me really captures how pedagogically, right, Cohn engages the classroom, that it was a space he created for dissonance, for there to be disagreement, and therefore, right, in this disagreement, there being the resources for discernment to take place in a real way, in community. And it also, for me, draws out this point around finding your voice, which undergirded Cohn's, right, my own experiences of Cohn's pedagogy, Cohn's teaching. What does that mean? What does it mean for you to have found, if you have found, your own theological voice, ethical voice, political voice? How do you define what it means to find one's voice?
Okay. So I'm just thinking that I did find my voice when I was Cohn's student, but then unfortunately I went and got a PhD at Princeton, and that chopped my voice right off. So I think Cohn's death and my reflection on what Cohn meant in my life has been really helpful to me in finding my voice, because it's been a long time. But reflecting on Cohn, recognizing the way that he shaped me has been very helpful in finding my voice.
This is so awkward. I don't know who, I'm trying to figure out who's leaning, who isn't. All right. So I'll say a couple of things. One is that it had to be so hard to be James Hal Cone, because while he talked about finding our own voice, so many of us wanted him to give us the voice that we wanted to have. And didn't, even though he would say, find your own voice, I did what I needed to do, now you need to do what you need to do. There was a real tension between, wanting this like huge, like if this huge man who's like 5'6", like this tiny man with a tiny voice but a huge presence, wanted him to be all that we wanted liberation to be and look like. And so I think for many of us, it was a process of, first of all, releasing him from that pedestal and recognizing his humanity. And also to then turn to ourselves and understand not only our own humanity, but our own commitments. What was at stake for us? And without the expectation that whatever is at stake for me must be at stake for everybody else. But what my job is to be able to speak to that with a clarity and a passion that cannot be shaken. And I think that's the piece with Dr. Cohn that I thought was, when he talked about finding your own voice, it is about understanding, what that clarity is. Where do you see God in your life with a commitment that cannot be shaken? And for him, the God in the world was the God that stood with Black people who were encountering some of the most horrific oppressions that the world has seen. And so the voice that we needed to find was, what was that expression for us? What is that expression for me? And how do I do the work of ensuring that I cannot be shaken? Because everything else around me will tell me that my commitments don't matter. And so, so the finding your voice piece was probably one of the keenest and yet hardest things to do, because with that also comes responsibility, and it comes with vulnerability. Because once you have that voice and you stand firm in it, there's going to be a lot of people that try to knock you off of that. And so to have that kind of vulnerability where you recognize that it is important enough for you to show up publicly with it, for you to commit your life to it, and as I said before, to be unshaken in it is really critical. And so I think that is one of the pieces. And it's really interesting that the time in which I personally found my voice with Dr. Cohn was the time when I thought I lost my voice. Because it was, people talk about being in his office. I was in his second office, that living room, where he puts you in this chair and you feel like it's the Inquisition almost, right? And you get in there and you think like you have to have all the answers, and oh my God, what is he gonna ask me? And I couldn't even tell you what the question was. All I know is that I choked up and I started to cry. And I thought, oh my God, Dr. Cohn is gonna think that this is like weakness, and it is. And in that moment, that voice became soft and guided me through a process of catching my voice again with the questions of what was happening for me. And the commitment around that showed up time and time and time again. And so part of being able to stand firm was also not just the understanding of claiming your voice, but what it also taught me was that there will be moments when the people that I am committed to lose their voice. And my job is not to give it to them, but to have presence with them and show them that I am there beside them and help to guide them into finding it in a stronger and firmer way.
Sure. So when I think of finding one's voice and I think of Dr. Cohn, I think of his journey. I think finding one's voice is an act of liberation, an act that works simultaneously on the individual level, the personal level. You think of Cohn, echoing Paul Laurence Dunbar, for a good portion of the early years of his life, he wore the mask. He wore it in seminary, he wore it in public. Him finding his voice was a process of him coming to grips with the rumblings that were going on inside of him, and him being true to who he was as a black man in the 1960s. And so him finding his voice operated on a personal level, but it was also deeply connected to a larger social context. It was also deeply connected to the movements of the day. Watts, Newark, these uprisings, assassination of King, of Malcolm, of Meredith, and so on and so forth. Folks out in the street, chanting Black Power, demanding liberation and freedom. All this had an impact and influence on him. And so part of him finding his voice was, yes, his personal growth, but then also understanding, okay, what role do I have to play in the movements that are going on in the broader world, the movements for liberation and justice. So yeah.
I know for me, when I came in to Union and was in Dr. Cohn's class, I really, really wanted him to give me my voice, but he wouldn't, and if anybody had been in his class, he's hard. He tells you to read, you better read, because he's gonna call you out, and I remember one time I wrote a paper, and he says, this is one of the best papers I read this year. So I was happy, and about 3 weeks later, we had to write another paper, but I didn't do good. That wasn't my best work. And he says, can you come to my office? I said, oh man. I know he caught me. And he said, what is this? Come on. And I wanted to lie. I wanted to find a, excuse. And he says, I'm gonna do this time, but I don't do this. I'm gonna let you do this over. After that, I didn't try to skate by, because I know he had my best wishes or my best ideas in hand. When he really took me in his office and told me, what is this? I knew I had to bring my best, And sometimes I don't want to do the work, but I want the rewards, And he taught me, you have to do the work. You got to do it, And that's what I do today.
I was introduced to James Cohn at Morehouse College during my time there in undergrad, and I read 3 of his books before I ever heard his voice. And in reading his books, I had a lot of assumptions about when I finally met James Cohn, what James Cohn would sound like. I knew it would be a deep, deep bass, and that he would be this tall, just tall, elegant man. And I met him, and it was not at all what I expected. And what I'm hearing from the panel is this relationship to the assumptions we made about Cohn, right, coming in. That we made, that so often there were these projections of this dynamic man who, right, would like offer us these dynamic resources and tools because he lived, so we assumed, this very dynamic life. And what struck me is in reading this last memoir is this theme. There's this theme that pops up in almost every chapter around loneliness. That James Cohn was a very lonely man, and he's honest about this and vulnerable. He takes it seriously about how his calling has been not only one of brilliant books and thoughts and lectures and essays, but one of seclusion. I want to read this paragraph here in the second chapter, What the Lord Has Done for Me, Black Theology and Black Power. On page 40, he says, many people, especially my colleagues at Adrian, didn't always understand me. They thought I was just a contrary Negro, difficult and angry, as if I had no reason to be that way. But I was obsessed with what I was writing. God created Negroes black, which must be good. White people defamed blackness, and that's evil. Jesus came to liberate blackness from whiteness. To ask me to back away from blackness would be like asking Malcolm to stop talking about, or Martin to shut up about poverty, racism, and the war in Vietnam, or James Baldwin to stop bearing witness to the power of love. In different ways, they paid a high price. In the case of Malcolm and Martin, with their lives. The price I would pay, mostly loneliness as a theologian, would be small by comparison. I'm thinking about what it means to be black in the academy, generally, and more poignantly in the theological academy, and even more particularly at Union. What was your experience, right? Like, so a personal reflection. I was sitting here before the program began, really reflecting with Charlene regarding what this year has been without James Cohn. And for me, right, there's what it means to walk through the halls, but it became evident, his loss, his physical loss became evident at AAR, at the American Academy of Religion. And I would turn the corner every so often, and I would viscerally feel, I would see a black man, right, an older black man, and I would recognize him as James Cohn. And I would feel myself, my mouth beginning to open to greet him, and I realized it could not be him because he was not here. And the loss for me was significant, right? Not only in so much as James Cohn is James Cohn and we love him, but James Cohn was an institution within an institution for me. I could go to him and not only process the reading and the papers we wrote, but I could process life experiences, what it means to be black at Union, what it means to engage certain classroom spaces, certain faculty members, certain students, certain administration. And I lost that. And so what I've seen as a result is black students really coming together in a very different way to create, to fill that void, to create a space for ourselves here to process. I'm wondering for you, in what ways were you engaging what it means to be black? at Union. What were some of your experiences here at Union that really caused you to reflect deeply? And then in what ways was James Cohn, if at all, helpful in that process for you?
Okay. Somehow, James Cone spoke truth to power. James Cone said, white theologians have blood on their hands. White theology is white supremacist. And somehow, he ended up in a tower at Union Theological Seminary, which is kind of interesting, really. And I think maybe doesn't happen very often, right? Somehow, Cone managed to ascend to the tower. But I think, for me, Cohn was unsparing in his critique of white supremacy and the white academy and white theology. And that was very, very important to me because I came from, like Charlene, I came from community organizing into seminary and needed to try to figure out what I was going to do. And so Cohn happened at a point in my life where I probably could have gone in many directions, but like I said, Cohn was part of the crucible that helped form me into a revolutionary scholar and organizer. And I think that that Cohn's bravery is what I want to highlight. Cohn was lonely, and there are a lot of black people in black churches that can't be bothered with James Cone. And later on, when I had students, I met all kinds of students who had never even heard of James Cone. I was shocked, right? But I made sure they knew it by the time they left. So Cone occupied a little niche, was sometimes reviled by the black church and other churches, and was up in his tower doing his thing. And I am very grateful.
Well, I'm still a student here, so I need to be careful what I say. I'm just joking. I'm joking. Keep it real. And I think that's an example that Dr. Cohn leaves with us, an example of someone who had to speak his truth no matter what. He had to speak his truth against the white theological academy and the white church. He had to speak his truth
And the black church.
against the
And the black,
there.
okay.
That's all right now. Against the, you said, against the black church.
Sorry,
Exactly.
sorry.
No, it's all good. Exactly. You know, you think of, his isolation, in the AME church. You look at his isolation in the academy. If you go out to his office, where his office was outside the door, it says, Mr. Cohn. Now think about that for a second. Mr. Cohn, here's a man who worked hard and got his doctorate just like all the rest of his colleagues. But outside of his office, it says, Mr. Cohn. What type of message was trying to be sent? Now, Cohn kept it there as a reminder of the situation in which he was in. But I think Cohn's commitment to truth and speaking it courageously and fearlessly is what helped create such loneliness. In that way, he joins many other great revolutionaries and freedom fighters who have also found themselves isolated even from the very people they work to help and liberate. And so for me, it's that example of despite the cost, having a commitment to truth, having a commitment to preaching it fearlessly. That's an example and a legacy that Dr. Cohn leaves. And so, for me as a student here, as a black student, as someone who during my tenure here at Union has found myself at odds with some folks, knowing that he was someone who walked these halls as well, someone who, despite the pressures he may have faced to watch what he said and be careful where he stepped, he still walked with his head held high, with his back straightened, with his chest out, with a deep commitment to the truth and to speaking it fearlessly. So that example will live with me. It's guided me up to this point and will continue to guide me going forward.
I remember the second year, they had called me in this meeting, and they said, this can't be your work. It's too good. So I went up to Dr. Cohn's office, and he said, wait, let me get my coat. Let's go down here and let's talk to him. Because he knew my work, and he was there for me. You know, he pushed back when I didn't have to push back. He pushed back, you know, and I will always remember that. You know, they were trying to get me out of here. You know, but Dr. Cohn said no. You know, when he spoke, they understood. They heard. You know, if I spoke, they would just brush me off. But when Dr. Cohn and then he went and got Dr. West, you know, they came down and they fought for me. I never had that before. You know, they really fought for me, and I applauded them. You know, thank you.
So I also thought that I was going to encounter a big booming voice, and you forgot to mention how sweaty he was. Constantly, the man was sweaty. He would come into class with a nice, crisp, clean shirt and leave with just, like, but that was a part of his, you know, like full-on engagement in the process. And in terms of what does it mean to be Black at Union, what does it mean to be Black in any space, really? Union is not unique in that. But I just give two stories. One was the question of what does it mean to be Black is not only a question for students at Union. I was also a course assistant for Dr. Cohn, and we were doing one class, and part of how Dr. Cohn structures the our teaching assistantships, you know, people do presentations afterwards, and I had a student in my section who proceeded to say that the coursework that we had just wasn't correct. It wasn't deep enough, and it proceeded to get up and go to the blackboard and begin to talk about the subject matter in the ways in which they thought was appropriate. And so this did two things. Three things. One, it said, because it was a male student, and I was the course assistant, it had to be clear that in that room, I'm representing Dr. Cohn. So to disrespect this space is to disrespect Dr. Cohn. And so disrespecting me as a course assistant, and I'm a woman and I'm a Black woman, but also disrespecting this curriculum that he put together. So here is a 22-year-old person, and we're talking about Dr. Cohn as this giant in Black theology, and you can have a 22-year-old, you know, white man determined that he didn't know what he was talking about, and that he could teach it better. So, you know, what does it mean to be Black in these spaces is not just a question for students. It is a question of what does it mean to be Black in society, where no matter how much of a giant you are always subject to deep disrespect by folks that have determined that they know what the world needs other than you. And so, but the other piece around that was the way in which Dr. Cohn structured this curriculum. This was ST 103. And he structured it because, starting with the classics, so it wasn't just that he wanted to show you his knowledge base, but he actually took the classics and decentered it. So he put you through an entire arc that ended up with most of the semester focused on those that were on the underside of history. So he showed that theology was always in the making, and it was the people who were the most exploited, the people that were the most oppressed, that had the clearest lens by which to know what God is doing in the world. So this was the arc that he used in his classes, and that was always where he centered everything that he did. So even in the midst of being clear about the role that Blackness plays in this country, not just in the academy, what anti-Blackness does to people, he also gave room and space to understand that anti-Blackness, white supremacy, showed up in a multitude of different ways and was experienced in a multitude of different ways by various people within society. And so to speak to also how he showed up and made sure that the Black students that were at Union would have a champion, and even when it showed up for them. And just like, Kendrick talked about, and I'm looking at Kim, you know what I'm going to talk about, Kim, because I would not be a Dr. Charlene Sinclair without a Dr. Cohn. It just would not have happened. And, it didn't only happen in ST 103 and beyond. Dr. Cohn, for those that remember and for those that don't know, after you do ST 103, you can't take another class with Dr. Cohn unless he says you can. So you got to show up, and partly, you had to show that you had the discipline to do the work, and you had to sit with him and prove that you had the discipline. It wasn't even just your grades. You had to show that you had the hunger and you had the discipline to do the work, and then you can show up and do a seminar class with Dr. Cohn. So he was serious. And I decided, I kind of like this academic thing. I am going to try to get into a PhD program. And so I got into Union, and at that time, Union took 7 students. This year they took 8, and 4 students received not just the tuition, but you receive housing as well. And so I received tuition, didn't receive housing. I wasn't one of the top 4. And I got a call to come to Dr. Cohn's office. And Dr. Cohn sat me down and said, he told me about the PhD students that had come to Union. Dr. Cohn was responsible for most of the first generation of PhDs, Black PhDs in this country, not to mention the impact across the world. So we need to be clear about what we're talking about. This is not just the father of Black theology. This is like, I would not be sitting here, many people would not be sitting here. But what Dr. Cohn said to me too was that, he said, Charlene, you're a mature woman. I didn't know how to take that. I was kind of older student, so I wasn't sure what he was getting at. But he said, I'm going to have this conversation with you because I think you can handle it. And he proceeded to tell me that by Union's own standards, I was one of their top candidates, and I received no money. And Dr. Cohn proceeded to go, let's put on that jacket, and went down to the faculty meeting and cut up. And I heard he had cut up, but I wasn't sure. But someone affirmed that he cut up in that faculty. It was a faculty member that talked about him cutting up. But I was affirmed that he did cut up. And by the time that meeting was over, I had the resources to go to Union. And it was, but it was two things. It wasn't just the money. It was the fact that I would have come here humbled and grateful that Union actually accepted me. Oh my God, figuring out how I would even make it through. But because of what he did, I knew I deserved to be here, which was far more than money could have ever done. And then he showed up again. I actually wrote my dissertation because I knew Dr. Cohn was dying. Because I wanted him to read it. And it is one of the gifts of my life that he was able to read it. And even in that moment, because literally, I'd heard he was sick, and I remember telling my mom, oh my God, what if something happens and I didn't finish this thing? And I came to Union, and I didn't even have a prospectus. I had a few pages with some thoughts about what I wanted to do. And I heard that Dr. Cohn would never go for it. And I went into his office, and he said, you must write this, and I will do whatever I can to support you. And literally, and I said to him, Dr. Cohn, I made a commitment to you that I would do something with Black theology that you don't expect. And he chuckled, and he said, well, all right now. And so when I found out that he was sick, and I was like, oh my God, I need to do this, I literally went to him. He said yes, and I went back home, and I wrote morning, noon, and night, and I finished it, like literally. And 2 weeks in, I had a month. I literally had a month to write this thing. And 2 weeks in, found out that I didn't go through a formal process, and so it might not even be read. And Dr. Cohn said, no, it's going to be read. And I came here, and he showed up, and everyone showed up. And one of the things, and I will say this publicly, because I wrote on Dr. Cohn, and I wrote a chapter reading his Black theology through Fanon. And what he said to me was that everyone says that somehow he is writing his theology on the frameworks of Karl Barth or all these white theologians. He said, would a person from Arkansas look to white theologians to speak about the life of Black people? And then he looked at me in the face and was the first person to call me Dr. Sinclair, and said, when I wrote Black theology and Black power, I was reading Fanon. And so for Cohn, his Black being was a being that no one but God could make. It was not a Black being that was against whiteness. So when he talked about finding your own voice, understanding Blackness, having to be Black, he was saying that you must understand the being of the most oppressed for you to understand what God wants you to do in this world. And so all that interpersonal stuff that people get into is nothing more than our inability to go to that place of what God truly means by looking at each other as human beings. How do we accept ourselves, not over and against the master oppressor, but how do we just truly accept ourselves as created by the Most High? And that's what he wanted us to know. And that's, if there's nothing else that I will take, is knowing that I am from the Most High is what will lead me, and no one can tell me that I'm not of value, ever.
And I just want to add that Dr. Cohn, of course, has had many interpreters. But I was at that defense, and Dr. Cohn said that most people, he feels, get him wrong. But he said that Dr. Sinclair got him right. So I'd be remiss if I didn't say that.
We opened up with a reflection on my own experience with Cohn, and I gave a general story about this James Baldwin class, the life and thought of James Baldwin. I did not speak to specifically what happened. A white woman decided that James Baldwin in The Devil Finds Work was anti-Semitic. And so the black students went up. I had veins, I was yelling, veins were popping out of my neck, my hands were on the desk, people were clapping and shouting, and it was chaos. And Dr. Cohn allowed it to happen to a certain point, and then he stopped. And he stopped the classroom by way of stopping the black students and reprimanding us. And that's what angered me the most, that there was no correction. And I'm wondering, what is going on with this man? And so we met in his classroom, and this is what he says. He tells me that the object of white supremacy is my demise, that I would die, that I would give up, that I would give in. And he tells me, and I'm asking, but Dr. Cohn, why aren't you speaking to them? Why aren't you getting at them? Why weren't you reprimanded us, you yelled at us. And he says, because I've been here for over 40 years. And they've been insisting to do the same thing. That for not only 40 years, but for 400 years, the narrative has not changed. The story has not shifted. And that my priority has to do with protecting the lives and the health of black students, of black people, such that the world might be a better place, right? Because for him, it is once we then are liberated, right, the world gains access to its own emancipation. And so he says that he saw us in this uproar, in this upheaval, and the veins in my neck, and he said that you were dying in that moment, that white supremacy had taken root in you, and you were responding out of correcting somebody who would not change. And he says that you have to shift your lens, and you have to prioritize, find what your priority is and speak to it. And so for me to find my voice, right, is to ground my voice in that priority, in our immediate emancipation, our immediate liberation by any means necessary, especially when it relates to matters of my health. And so I would like to end this discussion here with Dr. Cohn's own words. This is in the conclusion on page 172. He says, black people are resilient. We will never stop fighting for our humanity. I write because writing is the way I fight. Teaching is the way I resist, doing what I can to subvert white supremacy. We will wear down whites with our resistance and determination to be free. And we will, he insists, we will be free. Once people resist, they never stop. Resistance births hope. Hope pushes people forward and makes them believe nothing is impossible. As King said, we must learn to live together as human beings, treating one another with dignity and respect, or we will perish together as fools. There is no other choice. I choose life. And so I'm grateful for this panel. I'm grateful for the contribution, for the conversation, for all of you who are present. And I'm grateful also for the presence of now our ancestor, Dr. James Hal Cone. He is here, and he continues to choose life and invites us to do the same. And so with that, a round of applause for the panelists. there are no other instructions, we will be having a reception immediately following this event between 6 or whatever time it is now and approximately 7 p.m. And our next service, the preaching series, will conclude from 7 to 8 p.m.